Dozens of Marines standing in complete silence outside a small country church wasn't something the town of Cedar Ridge, Colorado had ever seen before. Especially not for the funeral of a man most of them had never met. But sometimes, what looks like coincidence is actually God answering a quiet prayer. It all began the day an 88-year-old widow named Helen Brooks, her hands trembling and her voice barely steady, walked into a small roadside diner and approached a Marine sitting alone with his canine. She didn't ask for much. She didn't ask for a crowd. She just whispered a simple request, one that would travel farther than she could ever imagine. "I just need someone at the funeral." And what happened next, no one in that town was prepared for. Stay with this story until the very end, because what you're about to witness isn't just kindness. It might just restore your faith in humanity. A cold winter morning settled quietly over Cedar Ridge, Colorado. The streets pale with frost, and the air heavy with stillness. Helen Brooks walked slowly toward Miller's Diner, her thin figure wrapped in a light blue coat, one hand gripping a wooden cane, the other trembling slightly from the cold. Or something deeper. At 88, she had learned how to move carefully through the world, but nothing had prepared her for the silence waiting at home. 6 days ago, her husband Thomas had passed away after 65 years of marriage, leaving behind not just an empty house, but an absence that seemed to follow her into every breath. She still caught herself listening for him, still turning her head at the smallest sound, forgetting, just for a second, that he was gone. Tomorrow was his funeral, and the thought that kept returning again and again was unbearable. There would be no one there. No children, no close family, no friends who could travel anymore. Just her, and a quiet room. The diner door opened with a soft chime, and warmth spilled over her as she stepped inside. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air, familiar and grounding. For a moment, she stood still, her eyes drifting toward the booth she and Thomas had always used. It was empty now. That simple detail hit harder than anything else. She forced herself to look away, taking a slow breath before moving further inside. In the corner sat a man she didn't recognize. Marcus Hale, 42, a former U.S. Marine, carried himself with quiet discipline. Broad shoulders, steady posture, a face marked by experience but controlled in expression. He wasn't loud, wasn't drawing attention, but there was something about him that made people instinctively give space. At his feet lay Rex, a 6-year-old German Shepherd canine with alert ears and sharp, watchful eyes. As Helen stepped forward, Rex lifted his head. His gaze locked onto her immediately. Marcus noticed without needing to look first. Rex didn't react like that without reason. He followed the dog's attention and saw the elderly woman standing near the center of the diner. He took in the small details quickly, the hesitation in her movement, the tension in her hands, the quiet weight she carried. He had seen that kind of grief before. Helen hadn't meant to approach anyone. She had told herself she wouldn't. All morning, she had repeated it in her head. Don't bother anyone. Don't make it worse. Don't ask. But the thought of Thomas lying in that church tomorrow with no one beside him, it wouldn't leave her alone. It followed her into the diner, into every step she took across the floor. She moved slowly toward the corner booth. Each step felt heavier than the last. When she reached Marcus, she stopped, unsure if she could even speak. He looked up calmly. "Yes, ma'am?" His voice was steady, not unkind. Helen opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first. Her throat tightened, and she became suddenly aware of how fragile she must look standing there. Before she could turn away, Rex stood and stepped closer, stopping just in front of her. He didn't bark, didn't move abruptly. He simply stood there, present. Helen hesitated, then lowered her hand slightly. Rex leaned in, brushing his head gently against her fingers. The warmth of it caught her off guard. Something inside her broke. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't mean to bother you." "You're not bothering anyone," Marcus said. She nodded faintly, trying to steady her voice. "My husband passed away last week." Marcus's expression shifted just slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss." "We were married 65 years, she said. The words felt unreal as she spoke them. "Tomorrow is his funeral." She looked down at the floor. "There's no one left to come," she continued quietly. "No family. No one who can make it anymore." The diner felt quieter now, as if even the background noise had pulled back. Helen tightened her grip on the cane. She paused, her voice shaking more now. "I just don't want him to be alone." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Marcus studied her carefully. Not just what she said, but how she said it. The restraint, the effort to stay composed, the kind of strength that came from having no other choice. "What is it you're asking for, ma'am?" he said. Helen closed her eyes briefly, gathering the last bit of courage she had. Then she looked at him. "I just need someone at the funeral," she said. "Just someone." The words hung there, simple but heavy. Marcus leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly. There was something familiar in what she was asking. Not the situation itself, but the feeling behind it. He had been to funerals like that before. Quiet ones. Too quiet. "Was he military?" he asked. Helen nodded. "He was a Marine," she said softly. "A long time ago, but he was always proud of it." That was enough. Something changed in Marcus's eyes. Not dramatically, but clearly. He glanced down at Rex, who remained still beside Helen, then looked back at her. "What time is the service?" he asked. 10 in the morning. Marcus gave a small nod. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm now. "We'll make sure he's not alone." Helen blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in his tone. She had expected hesitation, maybe even refusal. Instead, there was something else, something steady. "Thank you," she said softly. She turned and began walking back toward the door, her steps slow but slightly lighter than before. The bell chimed again as she stepped outside into the cold air, disappearing into the quiet street. Marcus didn't move. Rex remained standing, watching the door long after it closed. For a few seconds, everything was still. Then Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His expression had changed, not emotional, not dramatic, but resolved. Because this wasn't just about showing up. And as the screen lit up in his hand, one thought settled clearly in his mind. This was going to matter. The night settled heavily over Cedar Ridge, the temperature dropping fast as the last light faded behind the mountains, leaving the town wrapped in a deep, quiet cold. Marcus Hale sat alone in his truck in the far corner of a dimly lit parking lot, the engine off, the windshield slowly fogging from his breath. The world outside was still, but his mind wasn't. Rex lay across the passenger seat, his body relaxed but not asleep, ears occasionally twitching at distant sounds. The faint glow from a street lamp spilled across Marcus's hands as he rested them on the steering wheel, unmoving, staring forward without really seeing anything. He had heard requests before, people asking for help, for support, for something they couldn't do alone. But this one was different. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was urgent, because it was simple, and because it shouldn't have needed to be asked. Marcus exhaled slowly, leaning back into the seat. The memory came without warning, like it always did when something stirred it loose. A small cemetery somewhere far from home, dry wind moving through the grass, the sound of boots against dirt. He could still see it clearly, a casket lowered into the ground, a flag folded too quickly, too quietly. There had only been a handful of people there, not because the man hadn't mattered, but because time had moved on and people had drifted away. Marcus had stood there that day, jaw tight, hands still, telling himself something he hadn't forgotten since. No one who wore that uniform should leave alone. Rex shifted slightly, lifting his head and looking at him. Marcus glanced over. "Yeah," he muttered quietly, as if the dog had asked something. "I know." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, turning it over in his hand for a second before unlocking the screen. There were dozens of contacts he hadn't spoken to in months, some longer. People he had served with, trained with, bled beside. Some had moved on to quiet lives, others hadn't. He opened a private group thread. It wasn't an official thing. No rank, no orders, no obligation. Just a network of men and women who had once worn the same uniform, and still carried it, whether they admitted it or not. Veterans, handlers, a few canine units who had stayed connected long after service ended. Marcus stared at the empty message box for a moment. Then he typed, 88-year-old widow, Marine veteran, funeral tomorrow morning. She thinks no one will come. Not on our watch. He read it once. No extra words, no explanation. He hit send. The message disappeared into the thread, just another line among older conversations about work, life, random check-ins. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Marcus set the phone down on the center console and leaned back again, staring out into the dark. He didn't expect much. Maybe a couple of replies. Maybe one or two people within driving distance who could make it. That would be enough. It had to be enough. The phone buzzed. Marcus glanced down. A reply. Ethan Cole. Location? Marcus didn't smile, but something in his shoulders eased slightly. Ethan Cole was a former Marine staff sergeant, early 40s, lean build, sharp features, and a calm, deliberate way of speaking that made people listen. He had transitioned into canine handling after his service, working search and rescue in rural areas. Ethan wasn't the type to react emotionally, but he showed up when it mattered. Marcus typed the address and sent it. Another buzz. Tyler Benton. How many we talkin'? Marcus exhaled softly. Tyler Benton was younger, early 30s, broad-shouldered with restless energy, the kind of man who never sat still for long. He had served as a rifleman, known for pushing limits, sometimes too far, until a deployment went sideways and forced him to grow up fast. Since then, he had carried a different kind of weight. Quieter, more controlled, but still there beneath the surface. Marcus responded simply. Doesn't matter. Another message appeared. Ethan Cole. I'm 3 hours out. I'll make it. Marcus looked at the screen for a moment longer. 3 hours. That meant leaving now. He hadn't asked for that. Another buzz. Rachel Vance. Got a canine with me. 2 hours. Rolling. Marcus blinked slightly at that one. Rachel Vance, mid-30s, tall, athletic, dark hair usually pulled back tight, had served as a Marine canine handler during her years in. She had a reputation for being precise, focused, and not particularly talkative. The kind of person who didn't waste words, but whose actions always spoke clearly. Her dog,
A retired Belgian Malinois named Shadow was just as disciplined, trained for detection and patrol, still sharp despite age. Marcus hadn't expected her to respond. Another message. Unknown number added to thread. Then, "Send me time and place. I'll be there." Marcus frowned slightly, recognizing the tone but not the number immediately. It didn't matter. More replies began appearing. Short, direct. "I'm in. 2 hours out. Leaving now. Count me." Marcus stared at the screen as the thread slowly came alive, one message at a time. Not dozens, not a flood. Just steady. Rex shifted again, sitting up now, his eyes flicking between Marcus and the glowing phone. Marcus shook his head slightly under his breath. "Easy," he murmured. This wasn't a call to gather a crowd. This wasn't about numbers. It was about showing up. He picked up the phone again and typed one more message. "Service is 10 a.m. St. Michael's Chapel, Cedar Ridge." He paused, then added, "Respectful. No noise. No attention." He hit send. The responses that followed were immediate. "Understood. Of course. Semper Fi." Marcus set the phone down again, his jaw tightening slightly, not from tension, but from something settling into place. Outside, the wind moved faintly across the empty lot. Inside the truck, everything felt quieter now.
Rex leaned forward slightly, resting his head near Marcus's arm, steady and present. Marcus glanced at him. "She just wanted one person," he said quietly. Rex didn't move. Marcus looked back at the phone, the screen still lit with messages. One person. That's all she asked for. He exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said under his breath. "We can do that." But as the minutes passed and the replies continued to come in, not fast, not overwhelming, but constant in their own quiet way, Marcus began to understand something he hadn't fully expected. This wasn't going to stay small. And somewhere out there, in the dark stretches of highway beyond Cedar Ridge, engines would soon be starting, headlights cutting through the night, people adjusting plans without hesitation. Not because they were told to, because they chose to. Marcus leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for just a second, letting that realization settle. Then he opened them again, looking forward into the quiet night. Because by morning, things were going to be different. The first light of morning crept slowly over Cedar Ridge, pale and quiet. The cold air still holding on to the night as frost clung to the edges of the road and the rooftops of small houses lining the street. St. Michael's Chapel sat at the far end of a narrow road just outside town. A modest brick building surrounded by bare trees and a small gravel parking lot that looked almost untouched in the early hour. There were no cars yet, no movement, just the faint sound of wind brushing against dry branches and the distant hum of a town beginning to wake. Then, at 6:42 a.m., the first vehicle arrived. An old, dark green pickup truck rolled slowly into the lot, its engine low and steady before cutting off completely. The driver stepped out, a man in his early 50s named Daniel Pierce, a former Marine corporal with a weathered face, short graying hair, and a thick beard that had gone uneven over the years. He had the look of someone who had worked with his hands most of his life. Broad palms, rough skin, shoulders slightly hunched from years of physical labor. Daniel didn't speak much to people anymore. Not since returning from his final deployment, where he had lost 2 men from his unit in a roadside incident he rarely talked about. It had changed him, made him quieter, more deliberate, more aware of what absence felt like. He closed the truck door gently, as if even the sound of it might be too much for the still morning, then walked a few steps forward and stopped, looking at the small chapel. He didn't move closer. He simply stood there, hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze fixed on the building. At 6:51 a.m., a second vehicle arrived. A silver SUV pulled in beside the truck, and out stepped a tall man with a lean build and sharp posture. Ethan Cole. His movements were controlled, efficient, every action purposeful without being rushed. He wore a dark jacket over a plain shirt, his expression calm but focused. From the back of the SUV, a Belgian Malinois jumped down smoothly. Shadow, now older but still alert, his darker coat blending into the early light, eyes scanning the area with trained awareness. Ethan gave a small nod toward Daniel, not a greeting, not a conversation, just acknowledgement. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. At 7:03 a.m., another car arrived. A dusty blue sedan this time. Rachel Vance stepped out, tall and composed, her dark hair tied back tightly, her posture straight in a way that never really left those who had lived in uniform for years. There was a precision to her movements, even now, even here. She opened the back door and clipped a leash onto Shadow, who immediately moved into position at her side. Rachel's face was calm, but her eyes carried something deeper, something shaped by years of working alongside K-9 units in high-pressure environments where hesitation could cost lives. She had learned long ago how to remain steady, no matter what she was walking into. She joined the others without a word. By 7:15 a.m., there were 4 people standing in the parking lot. Still no crowd. Still no noise. Just presence. At 7:22 a.m., Marcus Hale's truck appeared at the edge of the road, moving slowly as it turned into the lot. He parked without urgency, then stepped out, Rex following a second later, landing lightly on the gravel. The German shepherd stood tall beside him, ears upright, eyes already scanning the small group gathered ahead. Marcus looked at them. Daniel, Ethan, Rachel. More than he expected, less than what might still come. He walked forward, stopping a few feet away, and gave a slight nod. "Appreciate you coming." Ethan answered first, his voice quiet. "Didn't think twice." Daniel gave a short grunt of agreement. Rachel simply nodded. Rex moved slightly ahead, then settled beside Marcus again, calm but attentive. There was no discussion about plans. No one asked what they were supposed to do. They already knew. At 7:30 a.m., the first sign that something was changing appeared. Not in the parking lot, but across the street. An older man stepped out of a nearby house, pulling his coat tighter as he looked toward the chapel. His name was Harold Bennett, a retired mechanic in his late 60s, with thinning white hair and a curious expression that rarely missed anything happening in the neighborhood. He squinted slightly, noticing the vehicles, the figures standing still, the dogs. He didn't approach. He just watched. At 7:38 a.m., another vehicle passed by slowly on the road, the driver glancing toward the chapel before continuing on. Then another. And another. Something was being noticed, but not yet understood. Back in the parking lot, the group remained quiet. Marcus checked his watch. Still early. Still time. He had told himself last night that even a few people would be enough. And standing there now, looking at the small group beside him. He knew that part was already true. Helen's request had been simple. Someone. She had someone. But as Marcus looked down the road again, he noticed something else. Headlights. Far in the distance, moving slowly closer. He didn't say anything. Not yet. Beside him, Rex's ears shifted slightly, picking up the same thing. Ethan noticed too, his gaze following the road. Another vehicle approached. Not fast, not loud, just steady. It turned into the lot at 7:44 a.m. A dark pickup this time. The driver stepped out, a man in his late 30s, tall, with a lean but hardened build, short cropped hair, and a scar running along his jawline. His name was Lucas Grant, a former Marine who had left the service years ago, but never fully left the mindset behind. He had the kind of presence that came from experience rather than rank. Someone who had learned to read situations quickly and adapt without hesitation. He walked over without speaking, gave a brief nod, and took his place among them. No introductions, no explanations. Just another person standing there. The group was growing. Slowly. Naturally. Marcus watched it happen. One arrival at a time. Each one quiet. Each one deliberate. No one was rushing. No one was trying to make a statement. They were simply showing up. By 7:50 a.m., there were 6 of them. Still not a crowd. Still not enough to draw real attention. But no longer empty. Across the street, Harold Bennett shifted his weight slightly. His curiosity turning into something else now. Something closer to understanding, though not fully there yet. Back in the lot, Marcus exhaled slowly. He glanced at Rex, who remained steady beside him. "She asked for one," Marcus said quietly. No one responded. They didn't need to. Because as another set of headlights appeared in the distance, slowly making its way toward the chapel, it was becoming clear this wasn't going to stop here. By the time the clock moved past 7:30 a.m., the quiet stillness that had defined the early morning at St. Michael's Chapel began to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt almost natural, like something unfolding exactly as it should. Another truck rolled in, then a second a few minutes later, each vehicle arriving without urgency, engines cutting off one by one, doors closing softly against the cold air. The people stepping out were different in age, appearance, and life paths, but there was something unmistakably similar in the way they carried themselves. Straight backs, controlled movements, eyes that took in everything without needing to speak. One of them, a man named Victor Hayes, mid-40s, tall with a solid, weathered build, dark hair peppered with gray and a thick, trimmed beard, stepped out of a black SUV with the slow confidence of someone who had spent years in leadership roles he never asked for. Victor had once been a Marine gunnery sergeant, known among his unit for his steady decisions under pressure. But it was the day he lost a young private under his command that shaped him most. Since then, he had carried an unspoken rule that no one under his watch would ever be forgotten again. He didn't greet anyone loudly, didn't ask questions. He simply nodded once and took his place beside the others, his presence adding weight without noise. At 7:42, another car arrived, a faded sedan that had clearly seen years of long drives. From it stepped a woman in her late 30s named Melissa Carter, shorter than the others, with a lean frame, sun-touched skin, and shoulder-length blonde hair pulled back loosely. There was a quiet determination in her eyes, something shaped not just by service, but by what came after. Melissa had served as a communications specialist in the Marines. But after leaving, she spent years working in emergency dispatch, hearing voices in distress every night, learning how to stay calm while others broke down. It had given her a different kind of strength, one that showed in the way she stood now, hands in her jacket pockets, gaze steady, absorbing the scene without needing to say anything. Beside her, a German Shepherd mix named Duke, about 5 years old, stood close, his darker coat rougher than Rex's, his posture protective but relaxed, clearly trained but no longer in active duty. Duke's eyes moved from person to person, alert but controlled, as if understanding the tone of the place. By 7:50, the parking lot was no longer empty. Still not crowded, but no longer quiet in the same way. Across the street, Harold Bennett had stepped further out from his porch now, arms folded as he watched the slow arrival of vehicles. He had lived in Cedar Ridge long enough to recognize patterns, and this didn't fit any he knew. This wasn't a gathering, not in the usual sense. There were no greetings, no laughter, no confusion, just people arriving, standing, waiting. At 8 a.m., the shift became undeniable. Cars began appearing closer together now, spaced minutes apart rather than 10 or 15. A dark blue truck pulled in, followed shortly by a white SUV, then another sedan. The gravel lot started to fill, not chaotically, but with a kind of quiet order, each driver choosing a space without needing direction, each person stepping out and joining the growing line as if they had all agreed on something beforehand without ever saying it aloud. One of the newer arrivals, a man named Aaron Delgado, early 40s, medium height with a strong, compact build and closely shaved hair, carried himself with a focused calm. His face was marked by a faint scar across his cheek, a reminder of an incident overseas that had nearly cost him more than just a mark. Aaron had once been a Marine scout, someone used to moving ahead of others, reading terrain, anticipating movement. Now, years later, that instinct remained, visible in the way his eyes scanned the area before he settled into place. Beside him walked the younger dog, a Belgian Malinois named Kira, just 3 years old, lean and agile, her movements precise, her attention fixed on Aaron's subtle cues. Unlike some of the older dogs present, Kira still carried the energy of active training, her muscles coiled but controlled, ready but restrained. She didn't pull, didn't wander. She stayed exactly where she was meant to be. No one directed where people should stand, and yet, by 8:15, something had begun to form. At first, it was just spacing, people naturally leaving room between each other, aligning themselves along the edge of the lot, facing the chapel. Then, without a word, without a signal, that spacing turned into structure. One line, then another. 2 quiet rows stretching slowly toward the entrance of the church. Marcus noticed it before anyone else said anything. He didn't move to adjust it. He didn't need to. This was something they all understood. By 8:30, the road leading to St. Michael's Chapel looked different. Not full, not overwhelmed, but alive in a way it hadn't been before. Vehicles lined parts of the roadside, more arriving in the distance, slowing as they approached, engines softening as drivers took in the scene ahead before joining it. The line of people had grown longer now, extending beyond the small parking area, forming a quiet path that led directly to the church doors. Still no voices raised. Still no unnecessary movement. Just presence. Marcus stood at the front, Rex beside him, both facing the chapel. He didn't count how many had come. That wasn't the point. What mattered was that they were there, and that more were still coming. Across town, a taxi moved slowly along the road toward the chapel. Inside, Helen Brooks sat quietly, her hands folded over the funeral program in her lap, her eyes fixed on the name printed at the top. Thomas Brooks. She hadn't slept much. Every hour of the night had been filled with memories, with thoughts she couldn't turn off, with the same quiet fear returning again and again. What if no one came? What if it was just her standing there when it was time to say goodbye? The taxi turned onto the narrow road leading to the church. The driver slowed slightly, then slowed again. Helen didn't look up at first, but when the car came to a near stop, something in the silence around her changed. The driver leaned forward slightly, squinting through the windshield. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I think you might want to see this." Helen lifted her head and froze. It wasn't a crowd, not all at once. It was something else. A line of people, stretching from the entrance of the chapel, down the path, along the road. Men and women standing quietly, some with hands at their sides, others holding hats or resting a hand gently against the chest. Dogs stood beside them, still, attentive. More vehicles were pulling in even now, more figures stepping out, joining the lines without hesitation. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't overwhelming. It was growing. Right in front of her. Helen's breath caught as the taxi rolled forward slowly, passing between the forming lines. Faces turned toward her. Not curious, not intrusive, but respectful. Quiet acknowledgement. The car stopped. The door opened. For a moment, Helen didn't move. She just looked. Then, from the front of the line, Marcus Hale stepped forward. He removed his gloves slowly, his posture steady as he approached the car. Rex moved with him, calm and focused. Marcus stopped just beside the open door and met Helen's eyes. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach her. "He's not alone today." Helen's lips parted, but no words came. Because as she looked past him, down the lengthening line that was still growing, still forming, still becoming something more than she had ever imagined, she realized this wasn't just someone showing up. It was many. And they were still coming. By the time the church doors opened, the quiet gathering outside St. Michael's Chapel had already become something far greater than anyone had planned. Yet it still held the same discipline, the same restraint, the same unspoken understanding that had defined every moment since the first arrival. Inside, the pews filled steadily, not with noise or conversation, but with presence. Men and women stepping in one by one, removing their hats, taking seats without hesitation, without needing direction. The small chapel that Helen had feared would echo with emptiness now carried a different kind of silence, one that felt full rather than hollow. Outside, the line remained intact, stretching along the path, with more vehicles still arriving at the edge of the road, more figures stepping out, closing doors gently, and taking their place without disrupting what had already formed. Helen stood at the entrance for a moment longer than she expected, her hands trembling slightly as she looked from one face to another. Strangers, all of them, yet none of them unfamiliar in the way they carried themselves. Marcus remained beside her, steady, giving her the space to take it in without rushing her forward. Rex stood just ahead, ears upright, his posture calm but attentive, as if he understood the importance of every second unfolding around them. Helen took a slow breath and stepped forward, and as she moved, the line shifted, not breaking, not crowding, but opening just enough to allow her to pass. Heads lowered slightly as she walked between them, not out of formality, but out of respect, the kind that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Inside the chapel, the air was warmer, filled with the faint scent of polished wood and old hymn books. The casket rested at the front, simple and dignified, the American flag folded neatly at one end, a quiet acknowledgement of a life once lived in service. Helen's steps slowed as she approached, her eyes fixed on the wood, on the shape of something that now held everything she had shared for 65 years. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to just that space, just that distance between her and him. Marcus remained near the back, not intruding, not stepping forward unless needed. Around him, the pews filled with people who understood how to sit still, how to listen without distraction. Ethan Cole took a seat along the aisle, his posture straight, hands resting loosely on his knees, while Shadow lay quietly at his feet, head lowered but alert. Rachel Vance stood near the side wall, choosing to remain standing rather than sit, her gaze fixed forward, her expression unchanged but focused. Daniel Pierce remained closer to the door, preferring the position where he could see both inside and out, a habit he had never quite lost. The service began without announcement. The pastor, an older man named Reverend Samuel Clark, stepped forward slowly, adjusting his glasses as he looked out across the room. He was in his early 70s, with thinning gray hair and a soft, measured voice that had carried through decades of small-town services. But even he paused for a moment, taking in the number of people present, the stillness, the weight of it. He had expected a quiet ceremony. Instead, he found himself standing before something that felt different. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice steady but touched with something deeper than routine, "to honor the life of Thomas Brooks." As the words continued, Helen listened, but not in the way she expected. The fear that had followed her for days, that sense of standing alone, began to fade, replaced by something she hadn't prepared for. Not relief, not exactly. Something quieter, something steadier. At the front, Rex moved. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't disruptive. He stepped forward slowly, passing between the pews with careful, deliberate steps until he reached the casket. He paused there, looking at it for a moment, then lowered himself gently onto the floor beside it, his body still, his head resting close to the base as if taking position. He didn't move again. Marcus noticed but didn't call him back. No one did. Because it didn't feel wrong, it felt right. As the service continued, people listened. They didn't shift, didn't whisper, didn't break the quiet. When Helen spoke, her voice soft but steady, sharing small pieces of Thomas's life. The way he fixed radios for neighbors, the way he never forgot anniversaries, the way he would hum to himself while working. There were no interruptions, no distractions, just attention. When it came time to say goodbye, the movement began slowly, one by one, not rushed, not crowded. Each person stood, walked forward, paused briefly at the casket, then moved on. Some raised a hand in a quiet salute. Others rested their fingers lightly against the wood for a second before stepping away. No one lingered too long. No one made a scene. Outside, the line continued. And even as the last few seats inside filled and emptied in turn, more people arrived, stopping at the edge of the churchyard, removing their hats, waiting without pushing forward. Among them was a man named Gregory Shaw, late 50s, tall with a heavy build and deep-set eyes, his face marked by years of hard living after service. He had once been a Marine infantryman, known for his strength and stubbornness, but life after the Corps had not been kind. It was only in recent years that he had begun to find his way back, reconnecting with others like him. He stood near the gate, holding his cap in his hands, and when he realized there was no room inside, he didn't try to enter. He simply straightened his posture and raised his hand in a firm, respectful salute from where he stood. The service came to an end quietly. No applause, no final announcement, just the shared understanding that something meaningful had been done. Outside, engines began to start again, one at a time. Not all at once, not in a rush. Vehicles pulled away slowly, merging back onto the road, disappearing into the distance just as quietly as they had arrived. Some people remained a little longer, exchanging brief nods, silent acknowledgments, then leaving in their own time. Marcus stepped forward again, approaching Helen as she stood near the casket, her hand resting lightly against it. He held out a small envelope. She looked at it, then at him. "What is this?" she asked softly. "Just something from everyone who came," Marcus replied. Helen opened it carefully. Inside was a folded card, its surface filled with names, dozens of them, written in different hands, different styles, but all sharing the same space. At the bottom, in slightly darker ink, a single line had been written. "No one leaves this world alone. Semper Fi." Helen's hand trembled as she traced the words. She didn't try to speak. She couldn't. Outside, Rex finally stood, stepping back from the casket and returning to Marcus's side. His job, whatever he had decided it was, complete. Helen held the card close to her chest, her eyes moving once more toward the door, toward the road where the last few vehicles were beginning to leave. They hadn't come together. They hadn't left together. But they had all been there, exactly when it mattered. Sometimes, what we call a coincidence is actually God quietly answering a prayer we didn't think anyone heard. That day, it wasn't just people who showed up. It was compassion. It was brotherhood. It was something greater than all of us. Something that reminds us God still moves through ordinary hearts. In our everyday lives, we may feel alone, forgotten, or unseen. But moments like this prove that kindness can arrive when we least expect it, often through the hands of others. Maybe today, someone out there is waiting for a sign, for support, for just one person to care. And maybe that person could be you. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Because stories like these deserve to be seen, and kindness deserves to spread. May God bless you, protect you, and bring peace to your life and your family.